At Dashdot, we do talk a lot about the theory of constraints. And a portfolio, your portfolio growth, your ability to get finance, etc. Basically, there are three constraints. There's capital, there's cash flow, and there's credit. And usually, if you have cash flow and capital, you should be able to get the credit unless there's some unusual circumstance. But those are the three C's, the three constraints. And what's interesting is a lot of people don't actually know what their constraint is. A mortgage broker knows what the person's constraint is, but often somebody might feel like, oh yeah, I don't quite have enough of a deposit. Then if you talk to a mortgage broker, be like, no, what are you talking about? They're doing 97% LVRs now. The problem is you don't have enough cash flow. But intuitively, a lot of investors, and I was in this bucket myself, you don't actually know what your constraint is. So it's very, very important to get smart advice on this. Otherwise, you can really mess things up. Hello and welcome. You are listening to Dashdot Insider, the auditory epicenter for passionate property investors seeking a life of freedom, choice, and abundance. I'm your host today, Emil Pinder, and joining me, we have Andy Bernardos, who many of you may already know because Andy has appeared on our podcast a few times already. Andy is a fantastic resource to have. He's a property strategy team lead. And today, he's going to do something that we have never actually done on the podcast before. And that is to walk you through how we develop the portfolio growth plans that we develop for our clients. Now, why is this important? This is super important because it can potentially save years and years and years off your property portfolio, your property journey, your property portfolio building journey. When I say years and years and years, I mean, it could be 10 years, it could be 15, it could even be 20 years. So, without further ado, I'd love to dive straight into it. But first, how are you, Andy? How are you feeling?
I'm good, mate. How are you?
Yeah, very well, thanks. Alrighty, portfolio growth plans. A lot of people don't think they're important. A lot of investors out there think, right, this looks like a great property. I'm just going to go and buy it because, oh, look, it's got really good cash flow. It's got really good growth potential or something like that. Maybe they know their neighborhood really, really well. And apparently, that's not the smart move necessarily. So, what do you have for us?
Awesome. Well, what I have today is a really cool thing that I'm going to show you. And in order to do that, I'm going to share my screen. What I'm going to show all of you today is essentially how much of a difference getting that first property right makes compared to not getting the first property right. Okay. And what I mean by right, it's not necessarily a good or bad property. What I mean is a property that might be great at something, but not great at what you need. Okay? Does that make sense?
It does. So it's about getting the first property right in a way that is going to set up your portfolio for what you need, which might be different from what somebody else needs. And the importance of getting that first property right, we're kind of talking about it in terms of, well, what happens if you don't get it right? What happens if you get a property that's not the right kind of fit? There are a lot of properties out there that could be the right kind of fit for you. And today we're going to see how much of a difference it can make.
That's exactly right. And in simple terms, an example of that would be, for example, buying a growth property when you're actually limited by cash flow, when your portfolio needs cash flow, or on the contrary, for example, buying a cash flow property when you're actually limited by capital. So these are the kind of things you don't want to do. If your portfolio needs growth, you must focus on growth. Your portfolio needs cash flow, you must focus on cash flow. And that is different. Different portfolios need different things at different times throughout the journey.
What's really important about that is at Dashdot, we do talk a lot about the theory of constraints. And a portfolio, your portfolio growth, your ability to get finance, etc. Basically, there are three constraints. There's capital, there's cash flow, and there's credit. And usually, if you have cash flow and capital, you should be able to get the credit unless there's some unusual circumstance. But those are the three C's, the three constraints. And what's interesting is a lot of people don't actually know what their constraint is. A mortgage broker knows what the person's constraint is, but often somebody might feel like, oh yeah, I don't quite have enough of a deposit. Then if you talk to a mortgage broker, be like, no, what are you talking about? They're doing 97% LVRs now. The problem is you don't have enough cash flow. But intuitively, a lot of investors, and I was in this bucket myself, you don't actually know what your constraint is. So it's very, very important to get smart advice on this. Otherwise, you can really mess things up.
Yes, and it's not always too obvious. So it's really important to know how to look at these things. Yeah. Awesome. Now, in order to sort of show this to people listening to this at home, what I'm going to do is show you two real life examples of two real clients of ours. We're going to call them, for privacy reasons, investor A and investor B. Okay. And some of the numbers we've changed a little bit. For
confidentiality, privacy reasons, we've tweaked a couple of the numbers just so it isn't too obvious who they are, because we do have guests on our podcasts and things like that. So we need to protect people's personal information. We take that really seriously at Dashdot. But the principle, I mean, you haven't tweaked the numbers too much, but we're talking about basically the same types of properties, the same numbers essentially. We've just tweaked them enough to protect people's identity. At the core of everything that we're saying is 100% it still applies, right?
That's right. Exactly.
Okay.
All right. So let's get right into it. Let's start with investor A. And investor A, in this particular case, we're talking about a couple around 30 years old, no kids yet, one dog, and they had a goal in very specifically $150,000 a year in cash flow in 15 years' time. And the reason was to support their future family, right, that they're going to build, and allow them to work part-time and spend more time with the family and so on. Not necessarily retire because they're young, but to allow them to have more freedom with their time. Cool. Now, in terms of the resources, the starting point, this particular couple was starting with $100,000 in cash, no properties, and therefore no equity, a borrowing capacity of $422,000, a total yearly savings of $15,000. So from their income minus their expenses, they were able to save around $15,000, and they were comfortable to contribute $10,000 out of those $15,000 to their portfolio journey. Okay, so their property journey.
All right, a couple of things to clarify there. That cash, that $100,000, sometimes if you don't have $100,000, one thing that we had a guest on recently, a mortgage broker, who talked about how parents or grandparents are helping out the younger generation with the initial deposit, not necessarily on the cash flow side or anything like that, but if capital is a constraint, sometimes, you might be listening to this thinking, oh, well, I don't really have $100,000. You may have access to $100,000 through family, through friends. There are some really creative strategies that can help you kind of get hold of that, or at least in terms of the way the bank looks at it. So that's important. Now, you mentioned the total yearly savings there of $15,000. They want to put, or they're comfortable putting $10,000 of that towards property. The other $5,000, that's for holiday lifestyle. That's to make sure that they're not kind of starving themselves to make sure the property journey works, something like that. Now,
With this particular couple, although their borrowing capacity was up to $422,000, because they only had $100,000 in cash, and that has to cover the deposit plus the additional purchasing costs, their actual maximum purchase price they can afford in this particular case was $400,000. Now, let's have a look at what options they had, right? So, high level, strategically, they had two options. Option one is to go for a cash flow property. And in this particular case, to achieve a yield that was aligned with their expectations, we were looking about around 7.5% yield, which is not something that is impossible to achieve. But of course, in order to achieve that, you would not be in a growth location, essentially. That was option one. And option two was to go for a growth focus with a more modest yield, let's say 4.5%, but in a really high growth location. Okay. Now, what do you think? Yeah, go ahead.
First up, I want to check something. You've said there for option one, that's a 7.5% yield. not in a growth location. But I know a lot of property investors who think, well, if it's yielding 7.5%, then gradually that's going to come down as the price goes up. And having a really good yield like that is an indicator that it's also going to be a growth location because the yield's so high.
That is a popular belief. However, when you actually look into the numbers, what happens is that when you're trying to achieve a higher yield, you usually have to expect a lower growth and vice versa.
Okay, so this idea that a 7.5% yield automatically means that the growth is going to happen to try to normalize that yield is basically not really that true.
Not really.
Okay, cool. All right. So we've got two properties here. One's a cash flow property, one's a growth property. I sense you're going to ask me which one I should buy for our client.
Exactly, Emil. Which one you buy?
It looked like they only had 100 grand. I don't know. I'm not a mortgage broker. I'm going to get this wrong. You've made me scared on the podcast. I'm going to get this wrong. Now, I'm thinking 7.5% yield. They're probably not going to be able to save enough of that. And they had 10 grand a year that they were happy to put into property. So I'm going to go for the growth. I'm going to go option 2. Fingers crossed.
The answer is, in general terms, it depends, right? You got to understand everybody's circumstances. And for this particular client, let's see how that plays out just by choosing option 1 versus option 2 for the first property. Okay? Now,
are you going to keep me waiting? Okay.
I am.
Okay.
But I think you're gonna like the outcome of this.
Okay.
So, option 1, we are here. Cash flow property. Now, as you already mentioned, the challenge was with the initial $100,000 in cash, because when these clients came to us, their first idea was, oh my God, we need a cash flow property because of our $10,000 yearly contribution. However, if you actually look deeper, the actual constraint, the actual problem was not that. It was at $100,000. Why? Because, Emil, that's the only cash they have, and they're going to spend all of that in the first property. Now, if that first
Right. So that means that they have capital and they have cash flow, but all of their capital is disappearing on this first property. So they're going to need to grow property to get into the next one.
That's right.
Okay.
So let's have a look now at what would happen if this particular client went with option 1. Okay.
Okay.
So what we have here is a couple dots, and these dots represent properties. The first property was the cash flow property. That's why it's in green. Then we got the second property in blue or purple. That's the growth property. And then any other yellow dots that you might see are balanced properties.
Okay, so having a look at that, are those months down the bottom there? So it's just like 18 months?
So what you got here is 2024. Property number 2, Emil, we're looking at 2034. That's 10 years after property number 1 for the option.
Okay. All right. That makes me feel like option 1 was not the best option. 2 properties in 10 years doesn't feel like a win. It doesn't feel like it's the smart move.
Exactly. And we're going to see why in a minute. But before that, I'm going to show you what would have happened, which is actually the plan that we created for them, if they would have chosen option 2. And that's the other graph that we see down here. So,
okay. That is a lot more dots. And it's kind of hard to see, but there are some yellow ones there as well. If I count, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 properties?
That's right. So the difference is 8 properties versus 2 in the same 11-year period that we're seeing here. All right? And the main reason is because in option 1, they wouldn't have gotten their constraints right, and they would have purchased a property that would have gotten them stuck, which is the cash flow property. Why? Okay. Well, the easy mistake to make is think, oh my God, we only contribute to $10,000 a year to our portfolio with $10,000 a year. Therefore, we must need a cash flow property. That would have been the mistake. Why? Because $100,000 in cash, Emil, was all they had. So if that first property didn't grow, it would take them at least 10 years to save up for the next deposit.
Okay. This is so important. This is so important because I know so much information out there in the property market is about cash flow positive, high cash flow, and that takes care of everything. And, you get the cash flow. It's like, oh, you don't need growth. The point of growth is to create more cash flow later. But if you can get the cash flow now, it's like a shortcut. But what we're seeing here from the data is, well, if cash flow isn't the constraint, you run out and you buy a high-yielding property with really good cash flow, it could really mess you up for like 10 years.
That's right. And that will be different for different people. But for these particular clients, that the constraint was capital. And you might think that, come on, Andy, 10 years of a property not growing is unreasonable. We have seen that in many, many markets in the past in Australia. If you get it wrong, you can experience that.
Okay. So this is actually realistic. It's not like, oh, well, they've just set this property and said it's not going to have any growth. There are a lot of high-yielding properties out there that do not experience growth, and they can really lock people up. And it kind of reminds me of something that Goose mentions a lot, and that is the most important thing for your property portfolio is not how much growth you get or how much of a yield you get or how much cash flow you get, and make sure that you buy optimal properties all the time. It's making sure that you don't get stuck. Because if you get stuck, that's 10 years of your property journey that could potentially be down the drain while you try to save your way to another deposit like Investor A would if they had gone with option one.
So yeah, absolutely right. Absolutely right. It's really important to get what your portfolio needs and to identify that first and then go out and get it. And the consequence in this particular case, of course, was a big difference between the foundation they could build. Because the foundation, the equity foundation, is what will give you the cash flow potential in the future. You said before, well, if you start to get that cash flow at the beginning, it might be at the expense of foundation, therefore might be at the expense of much more cash flow in the future. So the actual difference here would have been option one, you have a one property foundation and also a property that has not been growing for that long because you buy it 10 years from now. Because we're saying property number one didn't grow, so it's not much of a foundation. Versus option two, you buy the first property that grows a lot. That triggers a domino effect that allows you to buy more and more property. And you end up, by year 7, with a 5-property foundation. Not only that, you have an additional 3 cash flow properties by the same time.
Right. Okay. So what's interesting there as I look at it is I can see we've sort of gone the purple for growth, then we've gone yellow for a balance, then we've gone a couple more growth, then we've gone yellow, and then we've gone 3 greens. So for people who are just listening to this and not watching it, and you can't see what the little chart looks like. It looks like when they chose option 2, the high growth property, it's sold for the constraint that they had at the time. And then the next property is a balanced property, which is solving for the constraints that we can project are going to be popping up in a certain amount of time. And then we have another purple one, so we're solving for growth. So we're solving for capital, and we're getting a growth property. And then another growth property, then a balanced one. And then we have this really solid base. And so then we can go cash flow, cash flow, cash flow. And boom, boom, boom. We're really into the cash flow properties. We're still getting the growth from the growth properties, but suddenly we're kicking to cash flow. And I imagine that probably has a significant effect on how much cash that the client can be putting in their pocket each week and getting them close to that cash flow goal.
Bingo. And as you pointed out, it doesn't mean if they need growth, it doesn't mean it's the only thing they need. We do have to balance that with, for example, here, balanced properties. And that does change as a portfolio evolves. You have to keep balancing all those constraints, balancing your resources to optimize the speed at which you accumulate these properties so you don't get stuck.
So what does the end result look like in terms of cash flow and growth?
Exactly. So the difference between building a 1 property foundation late and 5 property foundation purchase way earlier in terms of equity means by year 2038, which is basically by the time
15 years, right?
Year.
That's what their goal was.
Exactly. So in this particular case, their target year was 2039, and you'll see in a minute why I'm choosing 2038, but that's the year before they achieve their goals. Therefore, the year they're going to restructure the portfolio to achieve whatever they want to achieve, in this case, cash flow. By that year previous to the target, option 1 provides a portfolio with $450,000 in equity, and option 2 provides a portfolio by that same year with $3,394,000 in equity.
Okay, that's a pretty massive difference.
That's a massive difference. And remember, Emil, what we are considering here is we're getting the first property different, but any other property after that, we're applying the best and most optimal strategy that we can. It's just the consequence of getting one property right or wrong.
Right. So like getting that first property wrong, option 1, they are locked up. And it doesn't matter how many optimal strategies you try to put on top of that, they're still locked up. Whereas we've really sort of worked hard, and I know the company, the tech team, work really, really hard at solving for constraints and being able to project those out for 5, 10, 15 years so that we're setting people up, we're setting our clients up so that we're not just trying to help clients buy their next property. We're trying to solve for the constraint in the 3rd or 4th or 5th property that might pop up as well, so that you can keep that journey going and not get stuck.
That's right. And the consequence of this massive amount of difference in equity, which is like 7 or 8 times, is obviously translated into the actual outcome they wanted, which was cash flow. Option 1 takes them to a portfolio that could only achieve a maximum of $40,000, $39.5, by that 15-year mark. Remember, Emil, their goal was 150. They wanted to work part-time, spend more time with the kids, do whatever they wanted. They are falling very, very short, 26% of the target at $40,000 a year. That's obviously, for them, not life-changing, and that's in a 15-year period. As you said, they lost at least 10 years. However, if they had done the right things, which they are in the process of doing, of course, by identifying the correct constraints, that second option takes them to a portfolio that achieves for them $191,000 of yearly cash flow by the same year, which is surpassing that goal of 150 and, of course, changing their lives forever from then on, right?
That is life-changing income. That's proper life-changing wealth and life-changing income at that point. Whereas if they go with option 1, your life's not really changing in 15 years if you're making an extra 40,000. I can't imagine that in 15 years, an extra 40 grand a year is going to make that much of a difference by the time you pay tax on it and whatever that's going to be by then. Okay, excellent. All right.
That's right. And what I want to stress is that to get this wrong is not as difficult. A lot of these might seem counterintuitive on the surface. So a lot of people listening to this at home would think, well, maybe I would have chosen option 1, right? But of course, it requires a trained eye and data and modeling and a proper system to identify these, of course.
I understand. All right.
Awesome.
You have another investor for us as well?
Yes. Yeah, let's have a look at the next one. So the next one we're calling Investor B. Okay. And Investor B is a man around 50 years old. And what he wants is to achieve $180,000 in yearly cash flow in 15 years to basically retire comfortably. Okay. And his resources was no cash, 1 property, which is his principal place of residence. And that property has about $350,000 in equity available. Borrowing capacity is $470,000, and yearly contributions, yearly savings towards property, around $20,000. Okay, so
this one's more difficult. I know you're gonna ask me to choose between a couple of properties.
This
one's more difficult.
Now, the maximum purchase price that this particular investor could afford was also $400,000, but for slightly different reasons. Why? Because of his equity, he can easily have there at least 3 deposits, right? However, his borrowing capacity has to account for not only the investment loan, but the equity loan also that he's pulling out from the PPR. So with a $470,000 borrowing capacity, you have the 400 plus the additional cost, and more or less it's slightly over 400, but for simplicity, I've rounded down to 400. Now let's have a look at the options, Emil. I'm going to put you on the spot again. So
he's got 350 in equity and 20 grand that he can put into property. All right.
That's right. I'm going to show you option 1 first, and you can comment, and then I'll show you option 2. Okay, so option 1 is the same growth property that we were looking at before. Okay, just for purpose of the example, same budget, same 4.5% yield, and also in a very high growth location. Okay. Now, option number 2 would be a cash flow asset, and in this case, not a 7.5% yield, but a 6% yield. A little bit less yield, but of course, this one is in a growth location. Not a high growth location, a lower growth profile location, but still a decent growth location.
Okay. So I would go option 2 with this one as well. I think he's got enough equity in his property, like you said, for 3 deposits. So I want to go with the cash flow one on this one.
Okay, but didn't we say that building growth was what we wanted, and the more equity, the better, and all of that?
We did, but I'm solving for a different constraint. But he's got good cash flow as well. He's got 20 grand. I don't know. Both of these look great. If a coin toss for me, I'd probably go option 2.
Well, I don't want to give it up yet, but you are definitely on the right path. Okay. Let's have a look. So how the way that actually played out, again, we still have here the bubble chart with all these dots that represent properties, balance, cash flow, and growth.
Gee, that's looking all right.
Yes. But it's, Emil, it's always, it can look all right or it can look great, right? So let's see how it looks. Now, in this particular case, if this particular client would have gone with the growth asset, still, he would have accumulated a decent amount of properties in the first, accumulation phase, and 3 foundation properties within the first 7 years, the foundation period. Now, option number 2, before we go into more detail, went with a cash flow property, but counterintuitively was able to accumulate more foundational properties.
Okay, what do you mean by foundational properties?
Okay, when we speak about foundational properties that are targeted to achieve basically growth, mainly growth. I'm talking about balance also as a foundation property, because a balanced property is, well, growth is what I want, but I still have to manage cash flow. Therefore, I'm going to go with a more balanced approach. But balance and growth, we're considering foundational properties, and then we have the cash flow properties.
Okay. All right. And the size of the dots is different in the 2 charts. Is there any significance to that?
It's just related to the price. Yeah. But
okay. So the bigger the dot, the more expensive.
Bigger the property.
Okay. All right. Cool.
All right. So in option number 1, yes, he buys a growth property. Yes, that property has great growth. But what happens? At this stage, this particular client already had the equity, the capital, to buy another 2. So growth was not the reason why he had to wait for the next property. So when we identify constraints, we have to ask ourselves, this is the golden question. What is the main reason I cannot purchase the next property sooner? And the main reason was serviceability. And what happens here is that we have a 5-year gap where not only he has those 2 deposits he cannot access, but plus any additional growth this property creates. And he cannot use it for another 5 years because he's stuck. He cannot borrow anymore. We have to take into account that he's using equity. So borrowing makes it a slightly bigger, larger dent on his borrowing capacity because he's got to put the loan plus the equity loan. Okay. Now, for option 2, with going with a cash flow asset at this particular case, he can then access that equity sooner because he recovers his serviceability sooner. And by the time he got to property number 2 in option 1, he's accumulated another 4 properties, a total of 4 properties. Now, these properties are balanced, but we're talking about 4 properties versus these other 2, right? So at the end of the day, he is less stuck. He's accumulating more properties, as you said before, and he's able to, in that 7-year period, accumulate a total of 6 properties instead of 3, so double the foundation. Counterintuitively, going for a cash flow property, which is not an inherently foundational property, will actually allow him to build a bigger foundation because it's addressing the actual constraint this particular client had. And that's the beauty of the strategy. Does that make sense?
It does, absolutely.
So what that means is that option 1 accumulates 3 initial properties that will carry the bulk of the equity creation, right? Versus option 2 that would have double the properties initially with that equity base that we're trying to build. That's 6 properties in option 2. Now, how does that translate? Yeah?
I'm just noticing something on the graph there. It looks like at around about the same time, you have these initial properties, or what we're calling initial properties, all settled down, and then it goes green for option 1 and option 2 at about the same time. And so really the difference is those initial properties where they're sort of the purple and the yellow color, where you're accumulating more. And it feels like that's what makes the big difference is, if you get that first one, because the only real difference you can see is that first property, right? With option 1, it's a growth property. With option 2, it's a cash flow property. Everything's changing towards cash flow at the end, but I'm guessing that the numbers are going to be pretty different.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All these cash flow properties are the same, pretty much. What actually changes the portfolio are these initial properties here that are going to create the big equity base, because that equity is what then will give you the largest cash flow potential.
Right. So that's a really natural cycle that a lot of investors go through, right? You have your initial property phase as you're building out the portfolio, and then there's a transition to cash flow as you're getting closer and closer to your target.
That's right. That's right.
Because most people have a cash flow target, right? Not necessarily a growth target. It's like how much am I going to be getting every year from my properties?
That's right. It's very common. And what will actually maximize the amount of cash flow you can get in the future is to build as much equity as possible initially, of course, within the constraints, and then turn that into cash flow. And the middle point there is the equity. How much equity are these 2 portfolios building? Let's have a look. Option 1 builds a very good $3 million equity portfolio by 2038.
See, that is awesome. 3 mil, yep. I could do with that.
It's awesome. Of course, this particular client had good resources, right? So starting off with a bit of equity. However, option 2 achieved a much better 5.2 million equity in the portfolio by the same time. This is what's going to make the cash flow difference.
See, that's really interesting because those two properties, they didn't look that different. One was a little bit higher yielding. One was in a high growth location, not just a growth location. So they didn't really look that different. And yet now we're looking at an equity difference of about 2.155 million, something like that, right? So 2.1 million in 15 years. That's the difference. That just getting that first property. Because like you said, when we looked at the first example, we've followed an optimal, right? What we would consider an optimal strategy as you sort of plot out the property purchases. And so just getting that first one right has a 155, something like that. $2,155,000 equity difference that we could be looking at down the track.
Yeah, which is huge. What's that? 60, 70% like more? Almost double?
It could be like 100 grand difference in cash flow.
We're about to find out.
We'll see.
Right? So
that's life changing around though. Yeah.
Exactly. Because then you will transform all that equity into cash flow. And the actual result in the cash flow at target year would be for option one, and pretty good, not modest, $145,000 yearly cash flow. However, Emil, we got to remember this particular client, we're talking about his retirement age.
Yeah.
And his specific number was 180,000. That was important to him. So
he's short.
Yeah, exactly. So while 145 is pretty good, it's still short of the lifestyle he wants to achieve. Now, if you compare that to option two, he's achieving $266,000 of yearly cash.
Okay, that's massively different. Now,
that's massive.
What it also means is that not only would he be a lot better off going with option two there in terms of cash flow, but it could also mean that he can stop his journey and start converting to cash flow earlier, right? So this is what we mean when we talk about shaving 3 or 4 or 5 years off your property journey. And you can see how much of a stark difference it makes just getting that initial property right. You're following just normal optimal strategies after that, right? Well, when I say normal, they're specially developed by our AI to be able to calculate these things. I do have one question to ask, though, one potential spanner in the works. And that is, when we're making these projections and we're like, okay, well, you'll buy this kind of property here because that will allow you to borrow X and get into the next property. Lending conditions change, interest rates change, all of these different kinds of things, they move a bit. So how do we kind of account for that when we're doing the portfolio growth planning for clients?
Well, I mean, mainly we got to remember this is not a static picture that will stay like this forever. This is something that it's a living creature, let's say, that would have to adapt, and we will have to tweak and revisit periodically throughout the journey to adapt to changes in goals or circumstances, also changes in the environment, of course.
Right. I've heard that, so I was talking to one of our tech team recently, I was talking to Julien, and he said when it comes to modeling this sort of thing, some of the things might change, like lending criteria might change a little bit, but there are a lot of things that kind of offset those kinds of changes. So the basic plan is very, very robust, right? Get this type of property now, then this type of property, then this type of property. That doesn't change. The exact date when you might be able to buy it, the exact price, the exact yield, those things might change, but they're very, very small cogs in the machine. The big cogs in the machine don't change too much, and the important variables, they don't really change in a way that's going to affect a portfolio growth plan.
Yes, that's a very good point. The offset part that you said, because since we're quite conservative in our modeling, even if one of the aspects, one of the resources turns out to be, I don't know, interest rates go up or whatever, lending criteria changes, and then that resource becomes more constrained, since we are conservative across the board, what would happen is maybe, on the other hand, you actually achieve more growth than we modeled. So the theory of constraints tells you to subordinate the resource you have in excess in favor of the one you are lacking. So in that case, we tweak the plan slightly now that we have more extra growth, we shift slightly towards the new constraint or the thing that now becomes more of a constraint.
Okay, so that would mean that as people progress through the years, they have their portfolio growth plan. Normally the revisions that we're making are shifting the next property purchase a little bit forward. They're able to get into them a little bit earlier because we've taken a fairly conservative approach. And then suddenly it's like, whoa, I might not be supposed to go again till next year, but bank says I can go now. Look, this equity growth that sort of was underpredicted has popped up and now I can go again, which is good. Okay, so that's why it's robust as well. That's another thing that makes the modeling really robust.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. All right. Well, on that note, I think it's probably worth reinforcing the importance of getting a property growth plan, because I know a lot of people that know an absolute ton about property, but this feels like it is a universal blind spot that property investors have. We're talking seasoned investors, we're talking people who've built multi-million-dollar portfolios, and you sort of look at it and think, well, if this tech was available, maybe they would have got there in half the time, or maybe they're locked up now and maybe they're stuck. So even if you know an absolute ton about property and property investing, and you know what yields are and what kind of yields you should be looking for according to your own intuition, that might be spot on, but it's worth finding out. It's definitely worth finding out. Get a portfolio growth plan. Find out what the potential constraints are going to be. At least find out what sort of property you should be targeting, because that's going to be really, really important, right? You can see the difference, right? We've looked at a couple of examples here. One of them was a $3 million difference. The other one was a $2.155 million difference. And the effect on cash flow that you can be pulling out is in the hundreds of thousands. So it really, really is important. And it really, really is a massive blind spot that I think most property investors have out there. So it's really, really nice to have had you on, Andy, and to take us through the level of detail and conscientiousness that goes into not just helping people into the next property, but helping them into the next one and the next one and the next one and the next one, and planning for that kind of growth and for the future, as opposed to one property at a time because of, a 5-point checklist or something kind of rudimentary like that. There's a lot more intelligence around the modeling that goes into this than what I think most people appreciate. And there's definitely nothing else like it on the market, right? This whole portfolio intelligence, portfolio growth plan approach to setting people up for an amazing future.
100%.
All right. Well, on that note, it feels like a good moment to say thank you very much, Andy. As always, it has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for having me. I had a lot of fun. And yeah, thanks so much. My pleasure.
Cool. We'll see you again on soon. Thanks heaps.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye, everyone.